summit of the Middle Teton. It's not there. Climb.
By Larry McMurtry, a Robinson Reads, brand new video.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of talking about some books. And today's book is very special. I just made a montage for it. You just saw that. I just played for you, and it coincides with two pretty cool BookTube events: June on the Range, that Michael K. Vaughan created to celebrate Westerns. This is year 3, I believe, it's going on. And the second event is Randy Ray's Lone Star Book Club. And this book is the perfect book to read for it because it's Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, the Pulitzer Prize winning epic masterpiece of the American West. So, if you're watching this video, and if we're all friends here because this is our little corner of BookTube, you've probably read this book, or at least you know of it. It seems to be a really popular pick for this event. I think Christopher Russell is doing it. I did it. I read it. We're going to talk about it. And so basically, a quick word before we get going is that I'm back, first of all, obviously. I've been traveling. I was in Wyoming. That mountain was in the Grand Tetons, in the Rocky Mountains up in Wyoming, like I said, which is where these characters in this book go through. So it kind of figures into the story. I thought it would be a perfect opportunity and time to read it because some of these people on their cattle drive are absolutely, blown away by these mountains in the distance, and I was on top of them, so that's pretty cool. So I read Lonesome Dove for the Lone Star Book Club and for June on the Range, going into it thinking that it would be kind of like a more expansive, grittier version of a Western, but instead of that, I got something that was really more filled with despair than I thought it would be, more filled with misery and hardship. Hardship's probably the best word for it. But I still really enjoyed it. I loved passages of it, and my banjo, funny enough, is I think ringing a little bit for my voice. That's kind of funny. Hey, it's June on the Range. It works. The moments of joy and raw pleasure in this book were fewer and further between than I'd anticipated. And I think that was just because my expectations were off. But I still really liked it a lot. I mean, this is a book that is, I think, or as far as I can tell, pretty much unanimously beloved. If not beloved, enjoyed. And I've heard only a couple of criticisms of it that seem to be mostly based on personal taste and preference than they do about the book itself. So, I mean, I went into it just having the highest expectations, and they were pretty much met, but in a darker way than I thought. That was my expectation/experience. I've also got with me here today, as always, my little notebook, and I made quite a few notes, actually. And I don't know if I want to make this video actually that long or not. Who knows? I mean, we're here to chat about a great book, so who cares, I guess, how long it takes. It's almost 1,000-page long book, But yeah, I got the introduction here, as I'm doing now. And one thing I want to say is that the first bit of this is going to be spoiler-free. So if you haven't read it, we're just going to chat about, the premise of the book, written time period and all that, my raw experience, the style of the book. And after we talk about the style of the book, I'm going to do a thing where I talk about the characters, just kind of knock them off, give my quick opinion on them, set our cast, and then talk about events in the book that left a pretty big impact on me. And then the last thing we'll talk about is what I think the book achieves. So pretty much 4 sections. This intro, the motivations and stuff, the characters, and then the events. Actually, no, wait, the achievements in that is part 4. Anyways, but I have it loosely structured. I started reading this book on a train from San Francisco. Read a little bit in the Tetons while I was looking at a bunch of beautiful yellow arrowleaf balsam root flowers with Tiwanaut in the background while Adam was actually reading True Grit next to me on a porch, on a rocking chair, reading True Grit. That was amazing. And then when I came home from all those travels, from all those adventuring things, I was so worn out and whooped that I pretty much laid down for 3 days and just read the book all day, every day until I was done. And yeah, that was my reading experience in terms of how I read it and where. the style of the book. This is the first one we're getting into, and I'm going to take off my hat because it's pretty hot here in Alabama. The style of the book is so interesting. It's mostly made up of people's internal thoughts and their monologues, and most particularly their motivations, what they want, in regards to where they are in time and where they want to be, what they want for themselves and the world and the people around them. And that is a really effective way to make up a large book, because if you're going to have so many characters, you want it to feel lived in. And the things that people want, what they're living for, it fills this book, and it gives it a lot of emotional depth, and a lot of times an emotional gut punch. Because one of the things that happens, if a character dies in the book, all their motivations die with them. Everything they wanted for themselves and everything else. And, this is a realistic Western, and people die. That is particularly brutal. Anyways, that makes up most of the bulk of the writing. If you were to throw a dart on a random page, you'd probably hit a person's what they're thinking. For instance, the character Dietz, he's a black man who works in the Hat Creek outfit. I need to actually get into a quick synopsis of the story probably before I go any further, because I can't just mention the Hat Creek outfit. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you don't know what I'm talking about. So let me give you a brief overview of this. This is a Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. It was published in 1985. It is about it's about two ex-Texas Rangers who in the mid-1870s to late 1870s decide to steal a bunch of horses and cattle from Mexico and make a giant cattle drive up from basically the border to Montana, past Wyoming, going through Nebraska and Kansas, and crossing lots of rivers along the way. That's the basic conceit or plot. How it happens, people's motivations, that's the juicy stuff that makes this book so good. But these two characters, I'll give you their names before we kind of run through, because they're just so important. The first is a guy named Augustus McCrae. And Gus, he's probably most people's favorite character if you read this book, is a large man who eats an abominable amount of food, apparently, and he has the gift of gab. He's a talker, a lounger. He just sits around drinking his whiskey out of a jug. He's educated. He knows a little bit of Latin. And he's just a pretty much universally good-natured guy. And he's kind of a bright spot in the story. And he's also extremely, and I don't even know how to put this into words, formidable, skillful, probably filled with more raw ability than anyone actually else in the book. Probably even more than Woodrow Call, who is his partner. Woodrow Call, on the other hand, a slightly more stout man, a little shorter, but he is a born leader. He is not talkative. He's pretty much the opposite of Augustus McCrae in every way except for their ability. And he lives by a pretty rigid moral code that he kind of expects most other people to live up to around him. And most people around him kind of fear him for that reason, all except Augustus, of course. And he pretty much runs this Hat Creek cattle outfit, which is after they're done with being Texas Rangers and rounding up and killing bandits, rounding up and killing people from Mexico or Native American Indians. They are those people. Just so you know, if you're getting to the story, they kill and are part of the American genocide of Native Americans in across the West. But we're at a point in history where the Native Americans are pretty much gone because of that genocide, and they're presented with this opportunity when a colleague of theirs, an ex-ranger, rides into town, a ne'er-do-well named Jake Spoon, who both Call and Augustus suspect is on the run from the law, and he is. And he says there's beautiful rolling fields of gold up in Montana. And because the Indians are gone now, or mostly killed, that pasture land, that grazing land is free. And any man can go up there and make a fortune. And what's funny about that is that neither Call or Augustus seem to really care about making a fortune. But they do this anyway. They round up a bunch of cattle. They steal a bunch from Mexico. And they steal horses from Mexico, too, because their one main Mexican rival dies. So they just kind of have free pickings of everything that they want. and start making the drive, and it's unclear why. And yet, because it's unclear why, it makes it kind of fascinating. You start to get those questions of the American West of seeking adventure, seeking lawlessness for its own sake, and yet they are the law. So there's all these kind of paradoxical things running around. That's the main setup of the book. Before we go further, I should probably just get into a quick roundup of these of the cast of characters, because it's hard to talk about this book without talking about them, because they're living characters. One quick thing though before I do that is I want to talk about this book is so funny. It's just such a funny book. It stops being as funny as it goes along because it gets kind of darker, but it starts really funny. It's very dry, very frank. You get these great one-sentence descriptions of characters. And like I said, most of the writing consists of inner monologue and motivation. And what that means is that you don't get much in the way of physical descriptions of characteristics. You hear only once or twice anything about a person. And then you're expected for their inner thoughts and maybe their actions to kind of fill them in. But when you do get one of those lines, it's often funny. So one of the cowhands who comes along to join this cattle drive, one of many, there's a dozen like him in the book, but this guy's name is Jasper Fant, and he's kind of a coward, actually. He's afraid of rivers. But the first time we meet him, we get this sentence. This is what he says. This is what Larry McMurtry says. He had a mustache no thicker than a shoestring, and a horse that was not much thicker than the mustache. Which is just like such a creative, great, funny way to bring in this guy, his thinness, his whole thin world, and he's a cowardly man. That little humor is great. Actually, the first sentence of the book is kind of funny, or maybe the first paragraph. This is what it says, because I love reading to y'all on my BookTube channel. Yeah, the first line of the book is this. When Augustus came out on the porch, the blue pigs were eating a rattlesnake. Not a very big one. It had probably just been crawling around looking for shade when it ran into the pigs. They were having a fine tug of war with it, and its rattling days were over. The sow had it by the neck, and the shoat had the tail. And that's the first paragraph. Come to think of it, that's a really good first paragraph for a couple of reasons. One, its rattling days are over. It's pretty funny. But two, we're in a world where pigs eat rattlesnakes. This is a tough freaking world, and it lets you know that very quickly. The other thing that I'll read real quick is, I always forget the name of this, epigram? Not epitaph, epigram? The thing that comes right before the start of a book. I'm going to read that to you, because it's really interesting, and I'll talk about it afterwards. This is what Larry McMurtry chose to put at the beginning of the book. This is from T.K. Whipple, Study Out the Land. This is what Mr. Whipple has to say. All America lies at the end of the wilderness road, and our past is not a dead past, but still lives in us. Our forefathers had civilization inside themselves, the wild outside. We live in the civilization they created, but within us, the wilderness still lingers. What they dreamed, we live, and what they lived, we dream. That's so interesting. And if you can't tell, that doesn't have to do with the inner lives of cowboys. That has to do with our relationship to cowboys and our relationship to these larger-than-life stories and figures and characters as 21st century readers. This is published in 1985, so late 20th century. This world was gone by the time this book was published. But this attitude, I think it's true. America is still pretty close. It's still a pretty fresh country. I hope it'll last longer than it's looking like it's going to last, but it's still a pretty fresh young country. And one of the things that makes it a little bit different from Europe or Japan, Korea, China, India, is that it has been conquered relatively recently, and the story of that conquering and its immediate effects are still being felt and lived by people today, by Native Americans today, by anyone really living in America today, but particularly out in the West, of course. And that inner sense lives with us more than it can for, a European with 1,000, 2,000 years of feudal history behind it. It doesn't feel like a raw, unconquered land was just right around the corner. But for us, it does. And these stories have, and for us, I'm talking about me and the American audience, but I'm sure there's lots of people out there watching who are from more civilized nations. And anyone can relate to that. But it is interesting. And this is on the back of the book, actually. What they lived, we dream. And that's cool because that's outside of this book. That's not part of the book. None of the characters talk about that, really. this concept, but they do talk about their dreams, and they're grasping, sort of, in many ways, for that final lawlessness is not the right word, but just adventure, the cleanness of it. The land is not ruined by white people. Augustus actually says that almost explicitly in the book. He said he wants to see it before the lawyers get to it. And the reason he's chosen this really hard life is because there's something about living in the settled world that he feels is kind of insidious. Which is funny because he's part of the conquering of that world. He's the guy who's killing all the Native Americans and the bandits and all that, and settling it. And yet that's because he doesn't know how else to really live. That's who he is in the world. It's very strange. Obviously, these are complicated characters, but let's get into them, shall we? The characters of this book, I could go on about them for a long time, but I'm just going to give them a quick introduction and then move on. I've already talked about Gus. I've already talked about Cole. The person who I would put next to them in terms of importance in the book, and who I think is kind of the hero of the book, if there is one, there are two candidates, but the one that I think is the main one is Lorena. Lorena is a prostitute in Lonesome Dove. She's the only prostitute, and she's the only one in the book, who goes through really the hero's journey in her own way. And I should go ahead and say right now, from this point on, it's probably going to be a spoiler town, a spoiler land, because people's fates are going to start getting brought up, and I'm not going to be introducing these characters as if you haven't read the book now. Now I'm going to be talking about it as if you've read it, because otherwise I have to hold on to things so flimsily, and it wouldn't be an interesting conversation at this point. I've given enough summary. Lorena, she's from Alabama, so we have something in common there, and she's pretty much been mistreated and abused by men since she could walk. Her only happy memories is of her being with her grandmother. She's essentially held as a sex slave by a guy named Mosby, and there's tons of mosquitoes that are always eating her up, and there's smoke pots to kill the mosquitoes, but they don't work, and it sounds like hell. And finally a handsome man comes along and rescues her from that, a man named Tinkersley. And he turns out to be even more brutal and abusive than anyone else, and starts basically, explicitly using her as a prostitute. So this was not a decision she made. She was forced into sexual slavery, essentially. And when Tinkersley finally abandons her in Lonesome Dove, she just keeps doing it because she doesn't know what to do. And one of the great things about the book is that you get to see in the book who sees Lorena as a human being and who sees her as a whore, just a whore, and who can actually look into her eyes and figure out, what she wants, who she is. One thing that the abusive man has done to her for her whole life is she rarely even talks to men. She mostly just allows them to do what they came to do and says nothing. And almost everyone falls in love with her because she's the most beautiful character in the book by a lot. The only other potential candidate has grown older. So she's a fascinating character, and she's probably my favorite character, with the exception of maybe Gus because he's just so fun. But she's probably my favorite character because she's the only one in the book, and again, this is a spoiler, she's the only one who ends up making a decision that is right for her. So many characters in this book feel like they're getting blown by the winds of time. The winds of fate, I should say. And helplessly just go along with it without really questioning it, but feeling miserable, feeling sorry for themselves. And the ones that don't feel sorry for themselves are still just kind of have no agency. But Lorena does. Lorena has this dream that she'll make it to San Francisco. And when, and the only reason why is because she's heard it's a cool place, and she's been born in hot places her whole life. It's a very, in a strange way, limited motivation for living. And yet, of course, like anything, it can become the sole reason for living. Speaking of motivations, everyone has motivations. I was telling you about this. The book is written mostly for motivations. Gus being, as I said earlier, the desire to see the unconquered West. Call, it's a little bit harder to tell because it's really to live by his own moral standards, which he kind of fails. I'll talk about that right after Lorena. But to finish up with Lorena, another cowhand, an ex-ranger, comes into town, Jake Spoon, as I mentioned earlier, and she kind of falls for him because he has high EQ, even though he doesn't do any work, and he's he's also a weak-willed person. He can read her and sees that she wants to leave and promises to take her to San Francisco, and he's also handsome, and so she attaches herself to him as the means to make it to San Francisco, but very quickly she discovers that he's worthless. And despite that, she doesn't let herself be ruled by him, and he hits her multiple times, and she doesn't let it break her. And eventually she's confronted with something that would break most people if it happened to them, which is that she's kidnapped and brutalized by white buffalo hunters and Native American Indians. And the presentation of Native American Indians in this book is really interesting because they get sometimes sympathy from the white characters. But most of the Native American Indians in this book, the major ones are not friendly. And so, that's the thing to be, I guess, mindful of you're going into this. But, if our main characters are white people, obviously the Native Americans aren't going to be friendly to them. Why should they be? And it is a relief to hear, at least that Augustus gives them the argument that, they're the invaders, they're the people who started it all, and that he thinks he's been fighting for the wrong side. But anyways, just to asterisk that point, Lorena is brutalized in a kidnapping and rescued, and even though she's deeply traumatized, after she's rescued, never gives up the will to live. She does maybe during the kidnapping, but eventually she makes it all the way to a home where she can be, where she can be loved by other people, it seems like, where people want her. And as soon as she comes to a place in the book that's good for her, she chooses it. And she stays with it. She makes her own destiny. And so often we see other people in the book be confronted with that decision, and they senselessly don't listen to it, and they just allow themselves to keep getting blown without making their own decision, often into death. Anyways, spending a long time on Lorena, but I want to just keep going quickly. Next, we got this character named Newt. It's Call's son. Call won't acknowledge him. Very sad. Newt is sort of the reflection of the reader in many ways, in terms of a device that can be used by the author, and that he doesn't really know what the heck is going on in the world around him, so therefore we learn through him. He's on these cattle drives, he's on these, rustling drives, whatever you want to call them, when they're stealing horses, and he doesn't know what the heck is going on, and he's confused, and there's smoke, and there's dust, and he doesn't know what he should do, in the same way that we feel as 21st century readers, because we don't know this world. So he's a great device, very sympathetic, and, we get to follow him as he, drinks for the first time and goes to a whorehouse for the first time, and it's sad in some ways, but in some ways he grows up in good ways. But he sees a lot of death. Dietz is a black man. He's the only competent man in the outfit who's not, Woodrow Call or Augustus. He's a great tracker, and he's one of the people who shows Newt real friendliness, and he's one of my favorite characters in the book, actually. And there's this great interaction that I marked out for y'all to read, because these interactions start to fade as the book goes on and hardship takes over. But this is right after Newt is given a gun, and this is what Dietz says. Dietz says, "Oh my, they done put a gun on you, ain't they?" Dietz said with a big grin. "I guess the next thing you'll be boss of us all." No thought that ambitious had ever crossed Newt's mind. The summit of his hopes had been to be one of the crew, to be allowed to go along and do whatever there was to do. But Dietz had said it as a joke, and Newt was in the perfect mood to take a joke. "That's right," he said. "I expect they'll make me boss any day, and the first thing I'll do is raise your wages." Dietz slapped his leg and laughed. The thought was so funny. When the rest of the outfit finally wandered down from the house, they found the two of them grinning back and forth at one another. "Look at them," Augustus said. "You'd think they just discovered teeth." As the day died and the afterglow stretched upward in the soft, empty sky, the Hat Creek outfit, 7 strong, crossed the river and rode southeast toward the Hacienda Flores. That's the end of a chapter. How well is that written? I talked about the style, but I didn't say this. It's really well written. It's just every decision made is really, really good and interesting. Larry McMurtry said in an interview, actually, that he says what many authors say, which is that you find the ending, you find the characters, and then you let them talk and let them make their decisions, and they make their way to the ending. You know where they're going to go, but they take over. That happens a lot in this book. And interactions like that are far and few between and become almost non-existent. By the end of the book, this is a spoiler, of course, by the end of the book, there's pretty much just death and despair left, in a way that I don't know really even worked on me. That could be a criticism. We'll come to it. maybe I'm misreading it too. Maybe there's more hope than I thought there was, and there's more reflective sadness than there is despair. Maybe it's that. We'll get into that. But yeah, Newt, what a funny, great character. And Dietz, his kindness, it means a lot in this book. Especially, Newt really needs it. Jake Spoon, already said it, never do well. He makes learning to fall for him, but he's such an interesting character. He tells her, I'll take you to San Francisco. And then, 3 pages later, his internal monologue that we're getting from Larry McMurtry, it's like, it always annoyed him when women started to believe that those things that he says to them, when they don't understand that he just says them to make them feel happy for a while. Why can't they understand that? And that's just so annoying. This guy is promising happiness to a person who's been nothing but miserable for her whole life and then is annoyed with her when she doesn't understand that I'm just trying to make you feel better. Jake Spoon kind of sucks. Next, we're just going to go quickly. Clara Allen, Augustus McCrae's old love. She's maybe the most fully realized character in the entire book. She's has this house outside of Ogallala that, as Augustus McCrae's old love, he sees as kind of a place that he wants to get to. One of the reasons why he goes on the cattle drive in the first place is that he knows he's going to pass by Clara's house on the way and visit her. And she's forged a life with herself with a cow trader or a horse trader named Bob, who is just kind of like a limp rag of a man. When she could have had this famous, Texas Ranger, she's kind of a mystery in that way. She has her own will, and she exercises it. And God, that feels so good to have a character who exercises her own will, or his or own will, because so many characters, like I said, don't do that. Moving on, Elmira. So basically, this is in a strange order. Jake Spoon is actually on the lam, as I mentioned earlier, and because he killed a dentist in Fort Smith, and the sheriff of that town was the brother of that guy, so that sheriff, whose name is July Johnson, goes to run after him. And his wife, while he runs after Jake Spoon, his wife Elmira, who's awful and shows no love to him whatsoever, runs away from home to abandon both July and her son, Joe, who's traveling with July. I'm starting to realize this is kind of a complicated plot. But instead of giving you the summary, because like I said, I'm expecting you to read this, I'm just going to go and say what I think. Elmira is awful. Elmira is one of the only characters in the book who I expect on a reread will find almost no sympathy. I've heard that from other readers reading about this, but also for myself. Everything she does is just awful. Her desire to go see D. Boot is such a fantasy and non-realistic idea that when she finally does meet him, of course, he's, instead of the stylish, coy, well-dressed, twinkle-in-the-eye, grinning man running out the door like a thief in the night, instead of that kind of romantic character, he's in a jail cell, wide-eyed and frenzied and about to be hung. And it's such a it's like a bad and getting worse type story that plot line was kind of hard to read and not really fun to read. But it provides, I guess, momentum for the plot. So Elmira, not a big fan. July Johnson, he's also hard to read about. He wants to be a good man, but he just can't be. He doesn't have what it takes in this world. His deputy, Roscoe, I gotta say, maybe my favorite part of the book, probably my second favorite part, because my favorite part is at Clara's house, but my second favorite part is when Roscoe is just on his misadventures, traveling, getting dragged by pigs. Roscoe is completely incompetent, and he's hilarious, and he should have stayed with Louisa and had that quiet life. When Janie starts to accompany him, the girl who throws rocks, I thought, oh, we're going to have this fun side adventure that will provide a contrast to the hardship of the cattle drive. And, of course, we know how that ends. Dish Boggett, there's nothing for him resolution-wise. This is just unrequited love. All right, I'm going to go and play my hand really quick. This is my hand. I think art that uplifts hope is better art than art that, I wouldn't say endorses, but puts forward despair as a theme. Cormac McCarthy is a famous despairing author. I haven't really read him yet, but I've seen No Country for Old Men, the movie. No Country for Old Men, the movie is a perfectly executed movie, I think, but because it's so despairing, I think it's lesser art than art that, lifts values of goodness. Because I think goodness is true and beautiful and all that. I'm an absolutist when it comes to art, right? This book, a lot of times, takes the despair out. It's not total. It's not totally despairing, but it does a lot. And more than I obviously would enjoy, but more than I think is even like right for the story, I think. Because it's a story. It is a work of fiction. And if I think about, for instance, the art that I want to make, you have to include despair. You can't just talk about good things all the time. But there are characters in here whose self-contained stories are pure bleakness. And I just started to think as I was reading them sometimes, why is this being written and why am I reading it? The other parts of the story don't necessarily have that, but a lot of the good characters just die. So I don't know if that's a criticism or if it's just a question. Just like, why? And I think maybe it's just because one of the themes of the book is luck. It's just chance and who's where and what at what time, and who survives and who doesn't. It's just kind of based on luck. And part of that is true, but there can still be hope in the face of luck. And I don't really see that in this book as much as I wanted to, but I only read it once. Anyways, Dish is an example of that because he's in love with Lorena and never gets nothing back. P.I. I love the scene in which, I'll get back to it later, but when he comes crawling through the plains after Gus is injured. P.I. as a character is really interesting because he's, I keep saying that about all the characters, but it really is true. He's a person who has one of the most limited internal monologues. He's not a very smart man, and yet he has one of the biggest hearts of anyone and cares about other people. And that's what other characters in the book could really use. And yet they look down on P.I. once because he's a black man, and some of the characters in the book are racist. Many of them are. But all of them could have used what he has and what they can't see now, which is great. The two cooks, both of them are Mexican cooks, and they're so different from one another, and they're so interesting. Bolivar, being an ex-bandit who just likes to, hit the crowbar against the bell, he is so mean and unlikable in such a funny way that almost makes him likable, that when he leaves halfway through the book, you kind of start to miss him a little bit. But he's replaced by the most genial, Falstaffian walking man, Pocampo, who just takes grasshoppers and cooks them, that you start to get the feeling that maybe, Larry McMurtry was feeling that his story was a little bit bleak and too full of bleak characters, that he gives us a character who's just warmth. And I really, really enjoyed reading about Pocampo. Will Barger, I love because he's the only character who can appreciate Augustus's humor and his intelligence. And then the final character I've gotten written down here is Blue Duck. And when I read the back of this book, let's see it. It says, Blue Duck right here. This is probably going to be backwards for y'all, but whatevs. Even reading the name, something was sinister about that. Blue Duck as a character is pretty much like Satan incarnate, very much like Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men, like I just mentioned. Having an unfeeling psychopath is probably a good trait to put into a Western because it's such a wild card. He's just out there in the story. He, of course, kidnaps Lorena. Anyways, I'm going to go through a couple of these events. We're on to the second to last part of the video because I've been yammering about this book because it's just so much to talk about. I'm going to go through the events that stuck out to me and in the order that they happened. The first thing that really stuck out to me was Sean O'Brien's death. He swims across a river into a nest of water moccasins. And when Newt looks back, I think the description is like Newt saw him surrounded by large brown worms, and he was screaming in them. And of course, by the time they pull him out, he has 8 snake bites on his chest. And Augustus says that doesn't even count the ones on his legs. And it's just a horror story death that came out of nowhere. The whole story so far has been adventures and cattle theft. And the first death you get comes from nowhere. It could have happened to anyone, and they're gone forever. Sean O'Brien, we got a little bit of his own life, and it's gone. He's gone forever. That was brutal, and that started to shift my tone. So started to make me think that this book would be different than how I thought it was. The second event is really a group of them, which is all the natural events that happen. The natural events, the thunderstorm, the dust storms, the lightning, the hail, the grasshoppers swarm. These have such an interesting effect because if you've ever been in nature, if you've ever been on a mountainside and the wind picks up, you don't get the feeling that the mountain doesn't want you to be there. You get the feeling that the mountain is utterly indifferent. It doesn't mind that you're there at all. It doesn't care. It's just going to do what the mountain will do as you cross it, as you pass through its world. And the plains, the Wild West, is that, except turned up. The snakes, the storms. A man is struck by a bolt of lightning and killed, and they just move on, like off screen, off the side of the book. And that feeling, more so than just characters being evil, that the whole world is filled with this kind of power that could strike you down at any moment, it makes this adventure a bit more grave as you go throughout it. It's really interesting. Okay, the other, what was I had something written down. Oh yeah, the Roscoe and Janie in the scene where the bandits try to take them and Janie's just throwing rocks at them. I thought we would have like a Huck Finn side quest with her after that. It was so funny and endearing. As far as I can remember, it's the last like funny scene in the book. And I loved it. And then of course Lorena's abduction. When Blue Duck comes up to her and Lorena says or thinks she didn't even see him coming. And she just quietly has to acquiesce to this thing, this power, this evil kind of force. You know there's something horrible ahead and horrifying, and then of course it becomes that. The things that happen around her are so brutal that I started to like sweat. And of course, when she's finally rescued by Augustus and Sheriff July Johnson, and Augustus of course shows his ability in his rescuing of Lorena, we see for the first time that Augustus, we see his ability. We see why people look up to him, why Carl respects him. And the scene where he slits his own horse's throat and uses it as not only the blood being a smell deterrent for the other horses because they're afraid of the smell, but also as like, a sandbag almost to protect him and off of which he can shoot. It was totally thrilling and great action. But when he finally rescues her and Blue Duck is not there in the group, and we see what's happened to the character Dogface, I started to get sick to my stomach about some of the stuff that was happening. I didn't know that was what I was getting into in the book. If I did, it would have been fine, but I didn't know that I was getting into that, and it was so brutal and so out of nowhere that I started to think, why am I reading this? And then, of course, in the meanwhile, we travel back to Roscoe and Janie, and then little Joe, who I haven't really brought up much, but Elmira's son, he's 10 years old, who's just following July Johnson around. And we witness from Roscoe's perspective the three of them getting brutally murdered by Blue Duck. And that scene is so dark. In my head, it's this dim blue, early morning light. There's a description of Roscoe being so hapless and incompetent. He moves like you move in dreams when you can't move or punch. And in that description, weird shifting things are happening around him. Janie falls and collapses and crawls over his legs and hears a sound and he feels warm like he's taking a bath, and then the shape grabs his belt. It's all very misty. And when you discover the bodies and you see what's happened to their bodies, you know what all that stuff means. You know how they've been dismembered. You know how they've been killed in detail. Anyways, I didn't want to go into it. It was so brutal that I not only thought that the rest of the pages following that felt meaningless, because how could life go on after something so brutal, but I was feeling that way about life, period, as I was reading it. I was just reading it like, what if this happened? What if terrible things happen to people I love? Like, what is the meaning of it all? And that's because, for one thing, I know that I'm kind of sensitive to that stuff, right? Obviously. I watched Saving Private Ryan once, and I never am going to watch it again, because I just can't see it. I'm just not that kind of person. Brutal, gory, human body violence is something that I don't really want to experience in my life. And if I do experience, I want to experience it only as it happens in real life and then grieve it naturally, then experience it in art. And it goes back to the question of why. I don't know. And I'm sure if I reread this knowing I'm going to go into that, I probably will think, well, this is just great writing, and it shows how cruel the world is that they're in. The Wild West, and there are these evil figures. But for the time being, I just kind of felt numb to it all. Yeah, that does achieve something actually for the book, now that I think about it, and I'll get to it later. It does achieve something that is part of good writing, but it was, I don't know, it wasn't what I wanted at that time, and so I didn't, that was so brutal and hard to read that I kind of just like, the rest of the book from this point on started to feel more bleak probably than it even was. However, after that happens, Gus and Lorena's developing romance is really tender and sweet. you get a sense not only now of Gus's ability, but for the first time also in the book, of his goodness. Because he's not really in love with Lorena. He's in love with Clara. And yet he stays with her. Because he knows that she needs him. And of course, he likes being with her. Not only for the sex, but of course he just likes being with her too. He likes her, I guess, for both things. But she's completely attached to him as being mentally for her the only thing that's safe in the world. And he understands that and is gentle about it. And so is Will Barger when Will Barger meets them. And Gus mentions that she's shy, which is very sweet. The next event that stands out is Jake's death. Jake, who runs with a band of outlaws and is killed. That, I think, brings out a quality of this book that is one of the things that I think has made it an American modern classic. And I think it's safe to say this probably is a classic by now, because what are we? We're 40 years out from this book, and it's almost universally beloved. Jake not being part of the outfit and not being a comic, funny, Byronic guy who just goes out and looking for, card playing and whiskey and whorehouses. Instead of that, he goes down a dark path that spirals and spirals and spirals until he's running basically with a gun outfit, only to be caught by his former friend Rangers, who hang him and kill him. That is so powerful, and so much, a lesser writer would have made him into that comic side figure, or at least had him stay with Lorena, but he just leaves. That really stuck out to me, and when he dies and he chooses basically to, he's getting hung. He says, I'd a damn sight rather be hung by my friends than some, judge or some sheriff. And he kicks his own horse and dies. He does get at least a semi-noble death. And it's a more realistic, in a good way, character arc. I don't know. It's very strange. It feels right, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like it's the most natural thing that could have happened. Anyways, Elmira and Biggs Way dying off screen after they go into the Indian territory was also a really powerful use of writing and of the way you hear about things versus how it's lived, which I'll get into later. And then, of course, there's my favorite part of the whole book. Wow, this is a 41-minute video so far because it's just so much to talk about. It's crazy. Everyone meeting at Clara's house and Gus getting to see her, even though her husband is upstairs dying after getting hit by a horse. I mean, that's so brutal. And Clara is very compassionate and shown in such a great way from taking care of him. But seeing Gus talk to Clara and seeing, best of all, the best part of the book for me personally in terms of hope, Lorena start to be appreciated by other people and learn that this is where she needs to be and choose that. And choosing not to just stay with Gus, who she thought was the world. That meant so much to me. If that had not happened in this book, I might even have a negative opinion of it. But because that happened, I feel like this book has some hope and some value with goodness. Of course, I'm kind of moving through this quickly because, down the line when Dietz is killed by an Indian, almost a boy, because his whole world, his whole people have been genocided and decimated, and he sees this man holding an Indian baby out to him in kindness. Dietz is trying to help and show the baby. He's experienced nothing but brutality his whole life, and so he kills Dietz only to be shot by Colin Augustus. That is, like, for me, textbook tragedy. And Dietz dies without an angry thought in his head or without any anger in his heart. He just says, I'm so sorry this boy couldn't understand that I meant to do no harm. That death is so sad and so brutal and so unexpected, so random. It didn't have to happen. Those kinds of deaths, it's preventable and it's irreversible. It's both of those things. That's a hard combination. He doesn't even defend himself. Anyways, okay, and then another event happens that's just out of nowhere that was incredible, and that's the Texas bull confronting the grizzly bear. Oh my God. I mean, it's just like, I guess it is pretty overtly symbolic of the Wild West being confronted by civilization and manifest destiny, but oh my gosh, does it work as a scene. And the grizzly bear has almost that magnetic force field ability to scare every horse away from 200 yards. What a scene. Just incredible. Of course, Gus's encounter with P.I., with the Native American Indians, getting shot with arrows, P.I.'s brutal escape, only for Gus to wake up after, escaping, essentially, with one of his legs gone and being told, I'll have to amputate the other one if you want to live, and saying no. I mean, what a strange way for a character to die, and yet it fits Gus perfectly. He doesn't die in battle. He dies making a decision for himself that no one else understands. So often in the book, he says something that no one else understands. And so often there are sentences like, Newt had never met a cowboy who blah, 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 blah. And Augustus defies almost all sense. And he dies doing that too, living by his own standards and what's right for him. I actually had that spoiled for me. I knew that going into it, that Gus would die. But I didn't expect it to happen the way it did. I thought that he would be killed randomly and, could have been a lightning strike for all I knew. But his death in the book in that way, as slow and sad as it was, it felt appropriate for who he was. I can see people being really, really disappointed with that death instead of him dying heroically, because the Indians that killed him, it was just bad luck. They're actually mostly friendly with people, and yet he just rode upon them, and they started shooting, and so he started shooting. And after that follows Call's depression, and this is how we end the book: is Call's depression, his inability to confront Newt and acknowledge him as his son. He does it in all the ways he can. He gives him his horse and he gives him his watch, but he can't do it. And Clara calls him a failure and a coward, and I think that she's right, because. And I'm not trying to be too hard on Call, but can you really call a brave man if he doesn't seem to really experience fear like most people do in battle? And when the only time in his life he has to actually confront something difficult, he fails to live up to it, and it drastically hurts that other person's life? That's a huge failure, and he feels it within him. And then only to be confronted with Blue Duck, who's been captured randomly, and Blue Duck tells him, I've stolen children, raped women, killed men throughout your territory the whole of your career, and you could do nothing about it. He gets told that to his face by this evil spirit, basically. And through all of this, perseveres to at least take Gus's body back to the orchard, where Gus and Claire had their happy memories. It speaks to Call being more of an engine than it does to him as an emotional, feeling capable man. He's not capable emotionally. He only is physically. And of course he gets back to eventually Lonesome Dove, and the only person there is Bolivar. And Bolivar says, and this is so poignant to me, he says with tears in his eyes, Capitan, Capitan. And something about that 2 words of dialogue just calls back everyone who's died, which is most people. Most everyone has died. Most everyone who we really cared about is gone. And you can see 900 pages back, them sitting in Lonesome Dove and eating beans, and Augustus making his biscuits. And with Bolivar, with tears in his eyes, who's normally not a sympathetic character, feels that, and Call can feel it. Only for Call to walk out into Lonesome Dove and see that the dry bean has been burned down by Xavier Wands because Lorena left. And to hear the last line of the book, that the reason he died and he killed himself is because he missed that horror. And what that means, of course, for Call and his relationship with Maggie and his son Newt, and his relationship basically to the world that's gone by, and that is just burned down in his own way. That's a heavy ending. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on basically most of the book, on the things that happen. I tried to bring up the things that were important, and yet it ended up being so long. I could have narrowed it down even more, I guess. But if you're watching, thank you. But there's I guess 3 things that I can take away from this book. The first one, or maybe the 3 things that stood out to me as great writing. The first one is how this book captures the difference of the lived reality of what happens in the world, and then the way we talk about it, the way it's presented. We see and feel Roscoe, Janie, and Joe's death by the hands of Blue Duck in such a brutal, visceral manner. And yet when people talk about it later, it's that they were killed by a bandit. But saying someone was killed by a bandit or killed by an outlaw feels so different and so much less horrific than the reality of it. And I think one of the things that this book does is that it shows us how the West was different from the way we talk about it now. From books like, this book that I'm reading right here, Silver Canyon by Louis L'Amour, that's not how it was. I think I maybe mentioned this, but Larry McMurtry said about this book that he set out to create a Dante's Inferno set in the West because it's a lot of misery. And that misery is visceral and it's real and it's present and it's happening to the people it happens to, and then they die and they're gone. And then saying later and writing about it in ways that doesn't capture that feeling is not reality. And of course, this is just a book of fiction, but still, I think it's going for that, and that's powerful. So that's thing one. Thing two is just the feeling of chance, the luck that happens. Who lives, who dies, who gets captured and why. Blue Duck gets captured by a fat sheriff in a lucky shot. This guy who seemed to be, a spirit for all anyone could tell. No one could get him. The way that Gus dies randomly by running into a band of Indians just up on a hill. One of the Rainey boys gets struck by lightning. Sean O'Brien, steps into a nest of water moccasins and is killed. And then July Johnson he's the main character, I think, who in the sense that he's the character who embodies the sense of luck the most, because he's not incompetent, and yet he can't live up to this world or that's just destroying everything around him, just because he's getting kind of bad luck. Of course, he doesn't assert himself enough in the world, and that leads to his downfall. But that feeling is heavy, and I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if it's a great theme for a book, but it's there and it's effectively done. And then the last thing is how these motivations, how these dreams, when people carry them and think about them, how alive they are in them. Their dream to get to San Francisco. Dietz's beliefs about the moon. And could you ride the moon? Are there Indians on the moon? All these things in people that are alive, how they die and are gone forever when that person dies. That is felt in this book more than most other books that I've read. The Tale of Genji kind of does that too. But in this way it's different because when people die in this book, they're buried in an unmarked grave and everyone has to move on quickly. And it hits you harder for that reason in many ways. So all of these things I'm talking about are dark. This is a heavy book. And it's talked about so rapturously and positively by people that I think I sort of thought that the book itself was going to be rapturous, and it's not. Maybe I'm more sensitive to that than most people, and I had this experience that's actually not the fullest reading experience, and I'm missing something, which is why you should reread and talk about it with y'all. But yeah, that's pretty much Lonesome Dove. I have some other passages marked out, but one of the things that after Roscoe, Janie, and Joe are killed, and when I just talked about how people move on so quickly, Augustus tries to confront July Johnson on this and brings up these themes I just talked about luck. He said, "Son, this is a sad thing. Loss of life always is, but the life is lost for good. Don't you go attempting vengeance. You've got more urgent business. If I ever run into Blue Duck, I'll kill him. But if I don't, somebody else will. He's big and mean, but sooner or later he'll meet somebody bigger and meaner. Or a snake will bite him, or a horse will fall on him, or he'll get hung, or one of his renegades will shoot him in the back, or he'll just get old and die. Don't be trying to give back pain for pain. You can't get even measures in business like this." So yeah, it's probably good advice, but when I read those words, they didn't mean anything to me because I was too sad about Janie. This cute, fun, rock-throwing girl has been brutally murdered. It's hard to, this is a book of fiction. Maybe I'm getting too into it. Who knows? But that's how I read. I just kind of get into it totally. That's tough. The only other passage that I got marked out, and it was the thing I wanted to bring up earlier, but I forgot to, but I'll bring it up and I'll read it anyways, is love in this book is not treated always with the same reverence by the characters in the book or even by the book itself. Normally, if someone's in love in the book, it's given a lot of tension. It's dignified. But people are in love in this book in ways that can be pathetic. July Johnson falls in love with Clara, and Lorena sees this and is disgusted by it, and talks about it in a way that I wish, I'm not trying to be like, all men suck, but I do wish that most men would hear this, because it's good writing and it's maybe for some people a good way to reflect. Anyway, she noticed that July sounded happier than she had heard him since she arrived at the ranch. She knew exactly what it meant, which is that July is in love with Clara. She had often seen him looking at Clara with helpless love in his eyes. She herself didn't care one way or the other about July Johnson, but the dumb quality of his love annoyed her. Many men had looked at her that way, and she was not flattered by it. They wanted to pretend, such men, that they were different, that she was different, and that what might happen between them would be different than it would ever be. They wanted to pretend that they wanted pretty dresses and smiles, when what they really wanted was for her to lay down under them. That was the real wish beneath all the pretty wishes men had. And when she was under them, they could look down and pretend something pretty was happening. But she would look up and see only a dumb face above her, strained, dishonest, and anything but pretty. Whew. I mean, that is just great writing. And of course, this is just Lorena's opinion. And right after that, she says watching him only made her long for Gus. He gave things that no one else could give. He wasn't dumb, and he didn't pretend that he wanted smiles when he wanted a poke, which is a euphemism in this book for sex. I mean, that's a developed female perspective, I think. And, of course, I'm not a female, and neither is Larry McMurtry. But, that's more complex than this Louis L'Amour novel, which is great in its own way, but the women in it are completely one-dimensional and at the whim of the men. Anyways, and, I mean, that's just well done, too. So, all in all, let me give my final thoughts. It's an hour-long video. Lonesome Dove. It's more than an hour-long book. It might be a masterpiece. It was harder for me to read than I anticipated because I had probably misaligned expectations with it. The joy that it gave me was sometimes so intense that I was like up around the room, but that was like 3 times. And then for the rest of it, a lot of it, I was kind of excited to not be in this world anymore. Even though it was so good and gripping. And when I wasn't reading it, I'd be like, oh, I kind of do want to read it again, but I didn't want to be in the world that much because it was so despairing. Maybe if I get over the fact, well, maybe just the sensitivity fact of it and just read it like in a way that's more fictionalized, I'll enjoy it more. But it's hard for me to do that. It's like when I play games of chess, it's hard for me to imagine like that there's anything in the world outside of the chess game. And I want so badly to win that it's almost unhealthy. And that can happen to me with books, which is like I get so into them. So needless to say, I generally choose books that I want to live in. And this isn't one of those books, even though it is an amazing book in its own way. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Lonesome Dove, my hour-long thoughts. I'm just surprised if anyone stayed, but if you did stay, I appreciate it, and hopefully I can be in some ways good rambling company. So yeah, happy Channel the Range, everybody. This is my first. I just realized this is like I think my second Western besides True Grit, and it was amazing. Let me know if you've read Lonesome Dove or if you've read the sequels or the prequels and if they're worth it. I will read this again probably in a couple years and we'll see what I think then. But for the time being, happy June. Stay rootin'. Stay tootin'. And I'll see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.
4. Oh.